infant colics. They're very common, and science cannot come up with what it is. Colics is
Colic?
like,
Yep.
yeah,
Yep.
it's stomach pain and
Stomach pain where it can't keep down its food sometimes, can't keep down even its mother's milk sometimes, vomited up, projectile.
but it's in children screaming. They say that it's like having a heart attack. That's how much it hurts.
Yes.
And
it hurts a lot. Yes.
And both my children had it, so it's. I guess it's a message, and I wonder whether there is
very
a general. Okay.
Okay. If the mother has a lot of terror and fear, the child that is unfelt and denied, so it has to be denied, the child will most probably have stomach problems, and including issues like colic and stuff like that. And it's an indication of the mother's denial of her own fear. And so the addiction that covers fears is generally, so if you look at the fear, the addiction that covers fears like that are usually addictions related to safety, control. So that's the areas to start with. Does that make sense? So your addiction to safety, addiction to control. Also, many times we have fear of pain, physical violence or pain, physical pain. So it's the addiction is to feel secure and have a painless life. We have a very strong fear of pain a lot of times. So we're afraid of pain, and our own fear of pain can create a lot of problems for our children. Children are not naturally afraid of pain. Have you noticed that? Like, they start walking and they're a bit tentative, right? And then bang, they hit their head, have a big cry for a few seconds down to 5 minutes or so, and then they were just in a lot of pain, right? And what do? Wobble back up again, and off they go again. They're not afraid of pain. We have learnt to be afraid of pain over a lot of conditioning from our parents and our environment, and as a result of our fear of pain, we then impress the same fear upon our children, and that often causes them to have painful maladies as a result of our own fear of pain. So we need to learn to address our fear of pain that we have. Many people are afraid of pain and afraid of emotional pain, and we need to address those two fears if we're ever going to grow. Yep. Okay. So that's the primary emotions that a person can look at if the underlying terror or fear exists. Of course, it indicates if it's to do with feeding in particular, and it's to do with food and feeding, and it's mostly breast milk that the child is ingesting, then it relates very much to the mother rather than the father. Does that make sense? So it relates very much to the mother's emotions rather than the father's. And for all of you mothers, it is a very powerful process for you to engage this process of real responsibility for what's happening to the child, because you will find you'll be able to work through a lot of unloving feelings inside of yourself quite rapidly if you embrace the process as God intended it to be embraced. Yes. Once a child and once the parents are if the parents were in an one-ment condition with God, then any child that was conceived would be conceived, and the term I used to use in the first century was conceived, I before E except after C, without sin. In other words, the emotional injuries of the parents, because if they were at one with God, they would have no emotional injuries. They would have no false belief systems. They would have no unloving belief systems inside of themselves. And so when they conceive a child, the child does not absorb any emotional injury. It doesn't absorb any unloving belief system, doesn't absorb any unlovingness at all. So this child would be conceived then without sin. In other words, it would have no injuries to begin with. So this is in the end, what I hope is that many millions of mothers and fathers can give that gift to their child. You imagine how these children would be born then. It would be just a wonderful thing. Unfortunately, because we have these different emotions, terrors, fears, shame, all these different types of emotions and grief that we need to work our way through, as soon as the child is conceived, its soul starts absorbing the emotions. And as soon as it starts absorbing the emotions, it starts changing its ability to be happy. And this is why, in fact, many children are born crying. Because by the time they've already had now 9 months of exposure to quite unloving emotions, which causes quite a lot of distress for them, emotional distress that they need to work their way through already, and they come out of the womb already starting to work through it as a result of that. It's a big responsibility being a parent, isn't it? If you think about the emotions that are involved and that affect the child. Yeah. Now, of course, any emotion that the parent works through even after the child is born will have a positive effect on the child. Because if the parent releases the emotion even after the child is born, because the child actually was inside of one of the parents and was conceived by both of the parents, there is a high likelihood the child will automatically process their way through the emotion if the parent does. So I have 2 children. One, my oldest son's 28 years old, and my youngest son is 26 years old. And I find even now, if I process through an emotion, working my way through something, usually within a few days, one of my sons calls me and asks me what I went through or something like that, because he's now going through a very similar thing. So even when your sons and daughters are adults, you can give them a large gift by working your way through specific emotions that you had not previously resolved. And they will automatically feel drawn into resolving those particular things generally. Some of the times, of course, they might be a bit resistive to that. So when they're an adult, they have that choice. But what I've found myself with my 2 sons is that even if they're a little resistive, that sooner or later they get into it anyway. So it's a wonderful gift you can give your children, even if your children are adults. But it's great to do it when they're very, very young, because it has a lot more powerful effect on the rest of their life. Obviously, if your children are in their 30s and you work your way through something and that relieves them, they've still had 30 years of having to deal with that particular burden. And once you've released the particular problem that you've had, that relieves them of receiving that problem from you, but it's still a burden that they had to deal with it for 30 years or so. So it's far better if you can do it when they're very, very young, or just before, even before conception would be great. If all of us worked through our gear before we conceived a child, by the time the child was conceived, we'd be very, very clear of the majority of our problems. And if we were, then our child would have very, very few problems and therefore have a great capacity to express itself and to learn without there being any impediments to that process.